with a couple of our external people and with Professor Jonathan Levie. I'm very excited also to have this event because it's one of our first outreach events by the Centre for Entrepreneurial Growth and Scaling here at NUI Galway. So it is in this sense a major milestone for us. Many of you may have heard about the Centre. Some of you maybe the first time I'm hearing about the Centre today. So it was just to introduce CEGS. So that's our short acronym for the Centre for Entrepreneurial Growth and Scaling briefly. What we really tackle are the challenges around the supports for growth and scaling of entrepreneurial firms, focused on Indigenous firms, but also foreign-owned businesses. So what we're very keen to do is identify the challenges in scaling, but also to offer insights for business and scholars as to what it entails to succeed with that challenging endeavor. And at the heart of CEGS is research-based insights, but also practice-based insights. And I think the panel today really speaks to that, and that we have a scholarly perspective and a practitioner perspective to bear on that topic. We're very excited also that we had over 130 people who registered for today's event. So thanks for all your interest, and thanks for joining us today. We have more attendees from over 13 countries also that registered, which again also speaks, I suppose, to the significance of that issue across geographies. A couple of housekeeping points before we start. The session will be recorded, but obviously we would love for the audience to engage with us. So if you have any questions that you would like to raise, any comments that you would like to make, please do so through the Q&A box. Also, we would love for you to follow us. So the Twitter handle is there, our LinkedIn page, you can also see there. So please start following the Centre to receive any updates from us. Yeah, with that, I wish you a very interesting and stimulating session. I would like to hand over then to Jonathan Levie to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Hello, everybody. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our two guest speakers today. Alicia DeSantola is an assistant professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at the University of Washington, and her research focuses on the strategic and organizational challenges associated with scaling high growth entrepreneurial ventures in technology and life sciences. Some of you will be familiar with her Harvard Business Review article from 2016 called Startups That Last. And if you aren't, you really should check it out after this webinar. Elaine Murphy is our second speaker. She has checked out that article, and she's going to tell you what she thinks about it as soon as Alicia has finished her talk. So let me tell you a little bit about Elaine. She's Senior Vice President for LiveTiles EMEA, which is located in Sligo in Ireland, which is a really beautiful part of the country. LiveTiles is a truly global scaling company. It was started by two Australians in New York, and now it has its EMEA headquarters in Ireland. Elaine, if you'll forgive me, I would call you a serial scaler because you've had multiple senior leadership roles across both Indigenous and multinational scale-ups. You're also a board member of the American Chamber of Commerce Ireland, and I'm proud to say that you're an alumna of NUI Galway. So Elaine is going to respond to what Alicia has to tell us, and then we'll throw it open to Q&A. And as Esther said, please use the Q&A, not the chat. And what will happen is that I'll read out your questions to Elaine and to Alicia, and we'll get the conversation going there. So please do pose your questions or challenges or points in the Q&A. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Alicia, who's going to talk to us about Startups That Last. Alicia.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that introduction. Hello, and it's so exciting to be here today. I'm actually located physically in Ireland as we speak, so it is terrific to be here and to get to know a little bit more about the Irish entrepreneurial ecosystem. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my 2016 article on Startups That Last and what motivated it, but also I should say that I'm going to talk about it through the lens of its original title, which was The 4 R's of Scaling Up. And you can thank our editor for the fact that every section of the article did not have a name that started with R's, although I still find it helpful to think about it in terms of this mnemonic device. So all of us who are on this call are probably very familiar with the entrepreneurial landscape. And we also know that startups suffer from high failure rates. At least 50% will be dead within four years. This is pretty well documented. And we know companies that fail. And of course, there's a variety of reasons why startups fail. Paraphrasing sort of the Russian proverb, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own unique way. Some companies run out of money faster than they can find revenues. But what really interested me and my advisor, Ron J. Galati, when we wrote this article was those that seemed to fail even as they grew. These companies that seemingly were a victim of their own rapid success. So they're growing rapidly, but suddenly seem to falter. And what was unusual about these companies is that they seemed to have it all. They had customers, seemingly product market fit. They had raised capital from investors, oftentimes very well-known venture capitalists, and they seemingly had this promising outlook and bright future. So why were these companies really floundering? And so that was the motivation when we wrote this HBR article, is this question of what happens when high growth ventures just simply run off the rails? They're seemingly full steam ahead, but suddenly they fall off the rails. And the more that we started talking to practitioners about it, the more that we started digging into it, the more that we kept hearing that it was just this problem of scaling up. And in fact, a venture capitalist, Ben Horowitz of the firm Andreessen Horowitz, has described it as, if you want to do something that matters, then you're going to have to learn the black art of scaling up a human organization. But notice his language there. He calls it a black art. It almost evokes sort of Harry Potter style defense against the dark arts, something that's secretive and unknown. And so our goal was to try to shed light a little bit on what scaling up involved and why it was so tricky for entrepreneurs, focusing specifically on aspects related to people and organizational challenges, although there are many different dimensions of scaling, certainly. And so one of the things that we started to notice early on is that entrepreneurs tend to grow their ventures opportunistically when they're thinking about pursuing profits or revenues. But paradoxically, they brought the same flexible approach to their organizations. And it posed sort of a little bit of a challenge because the opportunistic path may work really well in navigating markets, but such opportunistic approaches to growth can be problematic for human organizations, which may demand structure and process in order to be able to thrive at a larger scale. And compounding these issues is the fact that scaling is often perceived of as occurring inside this mysterious black box. I saw a very telling interview with Brian Chesky, the founder CEO of Airbnb, and he said something to the effect of, actually, the early stages of the companies, there's pretty good advice out there about it, about where to raise capital, how to recruit co-founders, other ways to really launch your company. But he said when Airbnb entered their scaling phase, that's where he felt like he was really left on his own, and he really had nobody to rely on for external advice, except maybe war stories from folks who had done it successfully before. But he really didn't feel like there was a systematic piece of advice that he could go to about it. So because there's this sense that scaling is a black box, one of the things that can happen is that there's a growing fault line between different camps. And so on the one hand, there are those that really value the entrepreneurial spirit, really value that sort of emergent, fluid, opportunistic approach to growing. So Peter Thiel, legendary venture capitalist, the founder of Fund, said things like, never ever hire an MBA, they'll ruin your company. And then on the other hand, there are other experienced professionals like Don Valentine, founder of Sequoia Capital, who have taken the opposite perspective. He said, I've never fired a founder too soon. They don't have structure and process. We really need people who understand management, and we need to bring them into the organization. So you have this tension between how do you value the entrepreneurial spirit, how do you value the creativity, the flexibility, the generative phase of an early stage emergent organization, and at the same time, how do you make sure that you have structure and process? How do you bring that maturity and professionalization into the organization as it grows? And we have these oppositional poles leading to a chasm. And so you start to hear lots of sound bites when you talk about scaling. You hear people say things like, oh, those companies just need to bring in the grown-ups. Let's just professionalize the organization. Let's just get it to be more mature. And the real question, of course, is what does this mean? How do we actually go about doing it? And so in brief, in the HBR article, my co-author and I profiled 4 very promising high-growth startup companies. And what's interesting is that their success paths were not actually linear. There was a lot of turbulence along the way related to concomitant organizational challenges associated with growth. And as we did interviews and we did field research with these 4 companies, which were Birchbox, which is a sort of an e-retailing and cosmetic company, Micromax, an Indian mobile handset manufacturer, Practice Fusion, a maker of electronic healthcare records, and Cloudflare, which is a well-known sort of internet security and traffic acceleration company. We really distilled 4 sort of overarching principles that seem to be common amongst their experiences with scaling. And some of these companies did better on some of these dimensions than others. But we describe those dimensions to ourselves internally as being roles, reporting, routines, and rituals. So those 4 R's. And you'll notice this is a little bit different than how we describe it in the HBR, and you can thank our editors for saving you from the 4 R's. But just to briefly highlight those, and we can go into more depth in the Q&A, roles is really about this defining role expectations. And what you're going to see is a transition at the early stage of an organization. Roles are going to be generalized and they're going to be easily interchanged amongst members. And now you're going to have to move towards more specialized roles. And so some of the changes that we noticed in roles that occurred during scaling, in the early days in the organization, you're going to see a lot of people with jack of all trades experiences. They're going to take on tasks as they come, and there's more of a sense of collective ownership. But one of the fundamental challenges of organizing is division of labor and integration of effort. So when you start to scale, as there becomes more complexity to manage and the organization becomes bigger, you manage that complexity by dividing up the organization into specialized roles. But concurrently, there's the level of expertise required to perform them also grows, because it's very different to be, for example, a VP of marketing at a 20-person company versus a 2,000-person company. And so you start to see outside experts hired because the level of expertise required to manage those roles also increases. But conversely, this leads to fissures between the old and the new guard, the old guard of generalists and the new guard. On the one hand, the old guard really feels like they helped to build the company and they helped to grow it, even if they didn't necessarily have deep specialized expertise. And then the new guard is coming in with their own professional expectations and they're saying, how was this done? How was this managed in the past? This is not how I would do it according to my large company experience. And so we saw that companies that seem to manage this transition well recognize that early employees could serve as valuable connective tissue for the organization, and they played more of a role than their immediate functional experience, but really in being cultural integrators as well. The second R is what we call reporting, and this is really about formalizing organizational structure and introducing hierarchy into the organization. And so just to briefly outline some changes in reporting that occur during scaling. So oftentimes in the early stage of the organization, you see a flat organization, although that may be a little bit disingenuous because there is one person who's not flat, or one set of people that are not flat, and that's usually the founders of the organization. And authority tends to be tightly wound and centralized around them. And conversely, there are often very non-specific job titles like throughout the rest of the organization. And oftentimes because people are all working together in one room, maybe there's less hierarchy and there's less formal training and feedback because the focus of attention is on the immediate job to be done, in the sense is that we don't have time to engage in career pathing. We really need to focus on the immediate task at hand. So as organizations scale up, there is this emergence of this organizational chart as you start to create layers in the organization. And that's also a function of this problem of information and decision rights. One of the reasons why we get hierarchy in organizations is that as decision makers, aka the founders, become more and more removed from the information needed to make day-to-day decisions, we have to decentralize the decision rights and push them down farther into the organization. And so one of the ways we do that is, of course, we create middle managers, which don't just provide sort of downward-facing guidance, they also provide advancement and feedback channels. And you see much more purposeful design of informal interaction as well as organizations scale up. And this was actually particularly acute in our Cloudflare study. You know, at the beginning, the founders proudly and vocally declared that there would be no job titles in their organization. And several years later, they actually found themselves having to recant. Although they did it in a sneaky way, they introduced formal reporting structures into their sales organization, which was newly adopted. And then they slowly migrated back to their original engineering organization. The third are concerns routines. And this is really about establishing standardized information and decision management processes. And sort of changes in routines that occur during scaling. So at the beginning, you may often find there's ad hoc execution, Band-Aid solutions, but a big challenge, of course, is that knowledge often resides in the minds of individuals. And of course, if we have that old guard, new guard tension, what's going to happen if those individuals walk out the door? The knowledge is going to walk out with them. So part of scaling up involves implementing proper information management and strategic planning tools. So that knowledge is shared and codified throughout the organization. It's not residing in a single person's sort of mind. And of course, this involves reflecting and updating best practices, which many startups actually struggle to do because they're often so busy fighting fires that they don't really take the time to reflect and update on those best practices. And so even though it can feel like a distraction, it actually is essential for the long-term health of the organization and can help save chaos later on. And importantly, we see a lot of codification and access to knowledge. And for those who are doing remote first organizations today, I would also add that I think codification of knowledge is particularly important in remote first organizations because you really need to make knowledge explicit and in order to be shared, because you're not going to have those informal interactions. And then the final one is about organizational culture, which is what we call rituals. And here, you have this classic problem. At the early days, the culture is based on a charismatic founder. And no, charisma is not necessarily a personality characteristic. Charisma, as classically described, has to do with the structural position of the founder as the progenitor of the organization, right? And also, you have to remember the founder plays such an important influence from picking the industry the startup is going to compete in, who the early hires are, who they're going to raise funding. And so the founder really knows everyone, and it creates this tight-knit click because people are attracted in some ways to this incipient organization that the founder has constructed. But over time, you have to reify those initial values of the founder into the fabric of the organization itself to create a widely shared culture. It can't just come organically from interpersonal interactions with the founder. And there has to be a way to codify values and reinforce them through rewards. So this will involve some elements of symbolic management, but a lot of it is going to be careful member selection and also orientation and sort of reinforcing of values. And again, here, I think that early employees who have been there since the beginning of the time can actually serve a valuable purpose in helping to transmit this culture to the next generation, particularly the founder cannot be involved in every hiring decision or every socialization and interaction. So that, in a nutshell, is the 4 R's of scaling, the roles, reporting, routines, and rituals. And I look forward to hearing Elaine's reaction to the article and a generative discussion with everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alicia. That's absolutely fantastic. Just before I ask Elaine to respond, I've got a question, really kind of a point of information almost. How do you define scaling? This is from somebody who's both a practitioner and an academic. What's your definition of scaling?
Yeah, so for me, I'm an organizational scholar fundamentally. So I really think about organizational processes. So I think about the concomitant organizational change and transformation that accompanies growth. But I certainly think there are lots of definitions out there, but for me, it's really about that process of managing complexity in the organization and how do you actually allow the organization to transform in order to accommodate growth in some other dimensions, whether it is revenue or goods and product shift.
Okay, great, thanks. So let me hand over now to Elaine Murphy. Elaine, what was your sort of reaction to reading Alicia's work?
Yeah, listen, Jonathan, number one, pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invite, and the Whitaker Institute and Esther as well. Yeah, I gave Alicia the feedback, and I said it was akin to her staring into my soul over the last 10 years and experiences that I've had to date in startups, but also that I'm experiencing today as a move from startup to scale up. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, John?
Yes,
okay,
absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of pieces straight off that very much hit me, and that you don't see talked about too much. We don't have everyday discussions about necessarily the functional leadership coming in, and the fact that many of the founding members and maybe that first, second tranche of hires that come into a startup, and as you begin to move into the scale-up arena, that they're often generalists and come from a background maybe that they have specialized slightly before, but generally have done a bit of everything. And that need to actually bring in and complement with functional leadership, you don't hear that called out very succinctly in much that you read and discuss today. The old guard versus the new guard as well, I think, is certainly an important factor. And I've talked a little to Alicia about the fact that you're seeing so much growth, exponential growth today, and done inorganically via acquisitions. And that, where she's talked about the dogma of in her article, and anybody that hasn't read it, look it up. It's Startups That Last: How to Scale Your Business. Certainly take a look. For me, there was nothing that I cast aside in it, and I said it really on the money in a number of areas. But that dogma where potentially you've got the functional leadership coming in and maybe looking to put in more structure around culture, etc., or to maybe skew the values somewhat. And particularly as you see companies in scale up or hyper growth mode today, where they're going ahead and making acquisitions, but potentially companies that are much older than them, have a lot of hierarchy involved and a lot of complexity in terms of their structure, and suddenly they're involved with what I would classify as pretty new, energetic companies that haven't got a lot of structure in today. So definitely there is a divide. There's certainly ways that it can be addressed, but it needs to be very deliberate.
Okay, we might come back to that issue of acquisition and how you integrate, and whether it's the issues around systems or culture, overlaps in roles maybe. But first of all, maybe I could ask you about your top two challenges that you've experienced in scaling from startup. What would you say were the top two challenges for you?
I would say probably information flow, and whether people are today that have joined us from academia or from industry, and regardless of what size you're in, it's always where you are, what vertical, etc., or sector. I think information flow is that classic nut that can be hard to crack, and I think particularly as you go from maybe that startup journey to scale up, there's a real challenge around that. And I suppose my second one would be in terms of probably introducing the structure required and resistance to that structure. It can tend to be a little bit of a dirty word for early joiners and sometimes the founders, where they've done an incredible job of standing up a company, but there's chaos probably abound, and it becomes incredibly tiring, and mistakes get repeated, and structure is required while also preserving the agility and innovation And I found that it's a challenge, but there's ways to address it. And, you know, for me, I would say, you know, adopt a staggered approach. Alicia mentioned an example a little earlier there in her presentation where she said, right, the sales team and the reporting, for example, and then, you know, it slowly permeated over into the engineering team. I think that's what you need to do initially when you're introducing the structure, and start to show tangible examples and gain. You know, you'll find that as you start to scale, you'll tend to have very, very ambitious plans, and that will require big change, and big change needs to be clearly planned. It's not always going to run smoothly according to that plan, but I think there's models that you know, you can introduce that won't impede the speed and agility within a startup, and that's the biggest concern of what Alicia would dub the old guard. On a practical level, I would say if anybody's to ask a question, I'd use models like Bain and Company. They have a rapid decision-making model. And with that, you can clearly show that you've had input from people, that you're informing people, that you're making a decision that relevant cohort have been in agreement. You're not going for decision making by consensus. You can expedite that and get a recommendation you know, discussed within an organization, you know, agree to a certain extent, and bring it to a decider. So there's a model that I would use. With respect to information flow, Jonathan, I would say the key to that is, you know, we know that, you know, you have to communicate with purpose always, but during periods of scale, you have to ante, you know, up the ante to a much greater extent. And when employees feel that they're in the dark, and particularly when, you know, leadership, you're in a period where there's a lot going on, you're potentially acquiring a company, you're scaling, you're going into new markets, potentially revenue models are changing, or you're bringing in new areas where you can attain revenue from. And you, because there's so much going on, you may not communicate with the exuberance that you necessarily would when you're kind of introducing a plan. And I think that the communication needs to be ongoing. If there's any type of blackout of communication where leadership go quiet, you will find that there will be, you know, the business will become rife with speculation, and a fear factor will come in. And particularly, is the scale up being you know, successful? And that is not productive, as we know, in an organization. So I would say, in terms of tips, you know, be empathetic, be cognizant of the fact that everybody learns at a very different pace, so, and retains information at a very different manner to one another. So leverage multiple channels and keep consistent with key messaging, no one-offs. You have to communicate your big change and do constant follow through. Just finally, maybe on that, Jonathan, and, you know, feel free if there's any questions. I would say make sure that there's a feedback loop during periods of scaling, but particularly, and I think it should be done traditionally in any organization at any juncture, but while you're scaling, make sure you've got a feedback loop to those within your organization that are closest to your customers, and make sure that they're empowered wherever you can, or have them to solve problems, but share the learnings upwards. That has to be constant, because otherwise people are blindsided and just, you know, don't have their eyes on the, you know, the main piece, which is your customers, and that critical piece on a consistent basis. Very, very easy as you scale to get pulled further and further away from them.
Yeah, and would you say it's important to have some, in talking about information flows, to have some kind of level of redundancy in the system? What I mean is, you know, several channels of information, because sometimes, you know, information gets blocked through one channel, but if you have several channels, you may get the information that you need to hear. I don't know whether either you or Alicia have thought about that at all.
I think for me as well, like particularly, there's so much focus on the founders and how, you know, and I suppose that key tranche that start off in the startup, start the management, kind of the old guard, as Alicia put it. So you've got that key tranche of critical talent that you're reliant on, being aligned and ensuring that the messaging goes out in a consistent fashion. So there's a constant watch on them to ensure that there's, like I said, consistency. It's really, really powerful to ensure that you've got other, I would say, information or culture ambassadors throughout your organization, that the messaging just isn't coming from the top always, that it is backed up, and it could be, if it comes out in the form of, you know, as many you know, of organizations will have, like regular all hands, etc. You need to ensure that managers, anybody with responsibility for people, are also resonating the same message, that they're consistent. So when you're getting out something, you know, a key piece of communication, just ensure that everybody is, you know, teed up around it, and that there's follow through, but not just from the top, that it comes at various different levels. And then, listen, the way we're enabled technically today, you know, there's backup in terms of your intranet, you know, your, be it Teams, Slack channels, etc. So there's various ways of getting and ensuring that the information is consumed. And obviously videos, a short, quick video means so much today, rather than you know, reading a huge wealth of information. So definitely think about all learning styles.
Great. We've got loads of questions coming in, and I want to get to them now. But maybe if I just ask Alicia to come back in, if you've got anything you'd like to sort of add to what Elaine had to say.
Elaine, I loved all of your points. I think that it's so important to have individuals who are connective tissue within the organization to be able to disseminate the message. And I also think that there's an important point about, what do you do with your old guard of people, the early people who might like the more emergent, flexible, innovative stage? And one of the things I've seen companies do very well is repurpose them, put them at the frontier of the organization. So as certain aspects of the business become much more specialized, than thinking, how do we actually put those people into a new and emerging area of the business so that they can exercise those general skills and enjoy these of the company that they like, but in a different aspect of business. And I think a final point that I thought was also interesting was, how do you really make people feel like they're included in decision-making processes? So making sure that you establish some sort of links to management if you're no longer able to meet face-to-face. One thing I saw Birchbox do really well is, for example, hiring, involving the old guard and hiring their own bosses. So if we're going to bring in a more specialized manager and sort of put them in over somebody who had been in the role initially, making sure that they're actively involved in the decision-making process, so it doesn't just feel top-down. There is some sort of inclusivity in the process as well.
Okay, thank you. So let me get to some of the questions. We may not be able to get to them all, but I will get to as many as I can. So this is something that perhaps both of you could speak to, and that's the role of digitization in scaling. So does it accelerate or does it decelerate scaling? What do you think? Shall we start with Elaine?
Yeah, listen. Yeah, I work in the digital transformation space, so I'm always going to be thumbs up on that one, Jonathan. But definitely think it's critical, and I mentioned there particularly companies that are, you know, moving into that hyper growth stage from scale up and potentially acquiring new, you know, basically new companies, you know, new skill sets, and that kind of old versus new functional leaders, generalists, etc. It's going to be important to understand again how they're going to take in information, how you're going to expedite and become more and more agile in across many of your functions. So you'll find that even in many early startups, they're reliant on, be it Excel, etc., and they at that stage can't afford some of the tools that are out there, CRM, tools, etc. They become critical if you're going to scale new markets, starting to take on more people. And listen, it's an age of information security now, so it becomes a must.
Yeah. And I wholeheartedly agree. The other thing that I'll add to that is it also creates companies that are more likely to be surprised by growth. So when you have digitization, and you see many more examples of companies whose users have exploded seemingly overnight, and suddenly they realize that they don't have either the tools, the structure, the processes in place to actually manage the size of the company that they're becoming. But their customers expect them to perform at the level of the size that they've suddenly become overnight. So because you have this time compressed process happening, it also increases the likelihood that companies become victims of their own success.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to a question, which is, how do you view scaling within a corporate when a startup has been acquired as an add-on division? I think I said we'd get back to acquisition, Elaine, so maybe this is our cue. So what's your experience of the issues around acquisition when a firm is scaling really quickly and takes on another a business, as in this question, it's as an add-on division. Maybe you could talk to us about the issues that you've experienced.
Yeah, so Jonathan, I'm just trying to address the question as much as possible. What's the second part of the question?
Yeah, so how do you view scaling within a corporate when a startup has been acquired as an add-on division? So I think LiveTiles acquired a Danish company, for example. I don't know whether that might be a good example, but I think that's the idea is how do you manage this scaling process as a result of acquiring a business?
Yeah, I would say the LiveTiles and the Wisdom, which was a Danish company that we acquired, is probably the reverse, as in I would say a young company, 5 years old, getting out there and acquiring a company that was maybe 15, 20 years old. So very, very different in tenure, different experience, and probably a shock to a mature company to have a pretty edgy startup that talked about, very matrix organization where you might work with the CEO one week and you might be working with, somebody in product development the next. That's a bit of a culture shock and something that requires a lot of work. I would say either way, even if it is a corporate that has acquired a younger company, I would have the question and the conversation very, very early on with the founders and the C-suite and sit down and say, how do we ensure that this is an effective marriage? Because that's what you're looking for. You're looking to potentially inject some of the vitality of the new company, maybe the younger startup, not to be swallowed into a potential older style hierarchical company. And not all corporates, not all mature corporates are like that. But I think the conversations early on, and then to seek education around the culture, as in to ask about what will the onboarding look like? What does the culture look like? And ask very specific questions about the culture, and then where have we the ability to influence that culture for areas that they find that, gosh, that's potentially old school, or you may find and maybe surprised it can be the reverse, as in that it can be quite edgy, etc. But even things about to a mature organization, how are they keeping themselves relevant? Like, what's the mix between agile teams and other teams that would be much more structured? So what that blend looks like, I think there's some key questions that they could sit down and take a look at and ask.
Yeah. Alicia, I don't know about you, but that reminded me of some research that one of your professors, Kathy Eisenhardt, did quite a while ago now around acquisition as courtship. So I don't know whether you followed any of those cases of yours that might have been acquired. If so, what happened to them, and are there any lessons that you can draw for corporates on how to keep those firms that they've acquired, keep them scaling?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question. I think we're starting to do some research on this, because organizational ambidexterity, this idea that you are going to exploit some domains while exploring new areas of businesses, is a perennial challenge for large corporations. How do you stay fresh and innovative? And so one approach has been, well, let's acquire a new division, let's acquire a new product area, oftentimes in the form of a startup. And what actually the research is showing is it's actually harder to realize the complementarities or the expectations than many companies anticipate when they acquire startups. And especially when you're acquiring for acquihires, Daniel Kim out of Wharton has some great research that basically shows that most acquihires will just quit. So if you're trying to acquire a company for talent, that's probably an ill-advised endeavor. The other sort of thing that we started to see is that actually the companies that seem to do the best when they're acquiring and they want to scale that is to think about how do we leverage our resources for things like distribution. But there are some companies like the Invention Hub or whatever product development hub where there's a lot of innovation. Maybe you just don't touch that. Maybe you just leave that alone and allow it to continue to do what it's been doing best. So thinking about what are the areas where we can add value in scaling, and what are the areas where we don't want to mess up what's going well and that made us want to buy the company in the first place.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So we've got a few questions around the context that enables firms to startup ventures to grow and scale up. I might come to that after this really interesting question from somebody who's in a startup. He says, I feel I'm one of the generalists that you are discussing. How do I stay relevant as this grows? So I hope you're. This is not making you really worried about your future. I think I'll let Alicia have a go at that question first, and then Elaine.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you've asked this question, because I actually think that there are 3 paths that you can pursue, and of course it's a question of what you want to do. So path number 1 is, maybe you enjoy being a generalist. Maybe you don't want to actually specialize. Maybe that's just not your cup of tea. So what's great is that there are many young companies that would love to have you in their early stages of the organization. And we do see this. There's a high prevalence of people who move between early stages of the companies. And I've interviewed a lot of them actually as part of my research. And actually part of their motivation is that they just like that. So you may choose to move on to another company. So that's path 1. Path 2 is you say, actually, I want to continue to specialize within my area. And so that's where you have to be willing to accept a little bit more narrow confines in the roles. And you also have to engage in a little bit of skill building to think, okay, if I want to continue to have my role, because let's say I'm a VP of marketing, right now the company is small, if I want to continue to manage it while it grows up, I have to skill build to be able to think about what are the tools that would be required of somebody who is doing that at a greater level. And path 3 is that you talk to the leaders of your organization and you say, I want to be pushed to the frontier. So I know that this area that I'm currently in, wherever I'm a functional expert, is eventually going to specialize, and it's going to get more into that sort of exploitation and execution phase. But we're going to be having new business issues that we're evaluating. We're going to be having new market opportunities. And I want to be put into that area so I can continue to exercise my unique skill set, which is this tacit knowledge about navigating early stage entrepreneurial domains. So hopefully one of those 3 paths will be appealing.
Great advice. Elaine, have you got anything to add there?
Yeah, I would say they should connect with me. Yeah, we could have a good conversation. I'm certainly in that arena as well. I'm absolutely a generalist and have built my career on the back of it. And I would say, you know, when I walk away from webinars, if I've got some practical tips, you know, it's a worthwhile use of my time. And to this, you know, I'll give you a couple of tips. And number one, as Alicia said, you'll find it serial. Some people will go from company to company and actually will be very well sought after. It's very hard grit and graft in the early stages of a startup. And your skill set is actually highly sought after. So that's number one. But number two, it doesn't mean that you can't bring phenomenal value to a more mature organization. Myself, like in my career, what I did is I was identified that that's where I wanted to stay very early on. I wanted to stay in the generalist category. Yes, I had interests. So, for example, I might say I've got a huge interest in being critical to the culture. So I'm going to be involved in ERGs, etc. So know kind of where your little bit of specialization or heavy interest lies, but you're also critical to organizations that want people to go in and actually inject new vitality into a department or a function, or to build out something new. So just think about that. I would say phenomenal skill set to have. Keep growing organically as well, and surrounding yourself, but ensure that you're surrounding yourself by functional leaders as well, so that you're learning in that regard.
Great, thank you. So we're heading into the kind of the last 5 minutes or so, and I wonder if perhaps we could move from inside the organization to outside the organization for the moment, to the environment, the context within which scaling firms exist and within which firms can scale. Because we've got a number of questions around that area of, we've got policymakers in the audience who are wondering, or agency officials who are wondering, what can they do to help firms to scale in their area? Elaine, could I start with you on that? What's your view? So you're based in the northwest of Ireland, in a fairly rural, remote region of Ireland. What's your view on this? You know, is there anything that government can do, or should it just get out of the way?
No, I think that they actually have a huge role to play, and the IDA was critical in terms of the decision making for Lifetiles to come to this region. Reason being that they, you know, did not see the barriers that potentially other companies would see about, you know, and to be honest, I guess they've been pleasantly surprised. And somebody asked me, I think in the questions there earlier on, what was one of the you know, big opportunities or surprises that we saw? That was one, as in that we came to this location in Ireland, and we made national press. Occasion after occasion after occasion, and they were like, wow, we're in the broadsheets in Ireland, and we've only announced, you know, a couple of dozen jobs, but the fact that they were willing to potentially take a risk and didn't see it as big a risk as other organizations would. The soft support from IDA was so critical. So that meant introductions to other companies that had started off, been in similar situations to myself, be it in other regions or even in region, introducing us to indigenous companies as well, where we could actually powwow to academia, as in to improve the links there. So, for example, in the Northwest, I became a founding member pretty earlier on of Tech Northwest, and that's where we started to bring a group of tech companies that, be it even one or two person startups that were just trying to make it, and we started to share success stories, everything from how we introduced ourselves to new markets, made introductions for others, etc. Just found it phenomenally well. And I think it's about just having that conversation up front. Where can we make introductions? What are you trying to do? And sometimes it might be stepping out a little bit and saying, let me introduce you to the wider network. So I would encourage anybody that's in that kind of startup arena today to get out there, have more conversations. I think I saw John Breslin in the audience as well. People like that, phenomenal to just give up the time, share their expertise. And I think that that's the game changer that we have, particularly in Ireland. People will invest in one another's success. They want to see us, have the edge to grow here, and they'll share their failures, success stories, and give their time. And that's not often the case in other cultures and countries. So definitely a thumbs up to the agencies that helped facilitate for us, particularly in Live Tiles thus far.
Great, thanks, Elaine. So finally, just before I hand back to Esther to wrap up, Alicia, I wonder whether you've got anything to add there. Thinking about these ecosystems for startups, to nurture startups. We know more and more about that, but what about scale-ups and scaling? Is there anything that that government bodies can do there?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting question. I mean, I think that a large part of it, of course, is having the necessary human capital to be able to facilitate continued growth. And part of that is when there are cluster effects or there are sort of regional ecosystems, it increases the likelihood that you're going to be able to pull in talent and other people who have helped to successfully manage to scale in the past and hire those people in. And of course, all the things that make a place attractive to live will also attract sort of people who have the experience necessary. I think I did want to bring up a point that we discussed earlier today, which is the other thing is that many startups are not going to incentivize on salary or compensation alone, even scale ups. A lot of this is about upside potential. To whatever extent local governments or local regions, I understand sort of tax regimes are very different across countries or across geographies, can do to incentivize people to take a risk on a young and emerging company and when they might not be able to get other forms of compensation such as salary, that might be conducive to encouraging scale-ups to proliferate in their region as well.
Yeah, that's a really important topic, and it's one that I know Scale Ireland has been working on for several years now. Thank you, Alicia. And with that, it's exactly 5 to the hour, and I'm going to hand back to Professor Esther Tippmann to wrap up. So thank you both very much for a really interesting conversation. Over to you, Esther.
Thank you, Jonathan. Wow, what a session. I mean, so many interesting insights, and it's fascinating to see the complementarities and synergies really between the academic research and the practitioner-based insights, and to have such a wonderful conversation. So I found it very stimulating, very refreshing, and I hope that everyone who has joined today feels the same. So with that, obviously, I would like to thank wholeheartedly Alicia and Elaine for joining us and being so generous and sharing their insights, their stories, their examples. I also would like to thank everyone who did attend and make the time to join us today. It's, as I said, our first panel where we bring scholars and practitioners together. There are more to come. So please, if you enjoyed today's event, please start following us on Twitter and LinkedIn. So the Center for Entrepreneurial Growth and Scaling at NUI Galway, and also maybe keep subscribed to the Whitaker Institute list, because obviously all events will be announced through the usual channels as well. And last but not least, I would also like to really thank Courtney and Angela from the Whitaker Institute for their support behind the scenes. Yeah, so with that, thanks so much, everyone, and see you again soon.
And thank you,
Thanks, Esther.
Esther and Jonathan, for organizing and inviting us to speak on such an interesting panel.
Likewise. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.